Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range U.S.-focused forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. Well, we need to know where we've been before we talk about where we're going. When we look at the temperature patterns throughout the month of July so far, we can see that much of the western United States has featured a slightly cooler than average pattern overall. While much of the eastern part of the country has really shown up here on these positive anomalies. And the reason why is primarily due to the big heat wave that moved through this part of the country. So a lot of these numbers in here showing you 5, 6, 7 degrees above average was really added to by the extreme heat that we saw in the last week here. Now, some of that was detrimental to crops because some of the locations inside that circle there did not get the rain and thunderstorms that other places did get. And so they endured this heat with some very, very dry conditions. So overall, we can't look at this and say that this was favorable, even though the crop in that area really accelerated in its growth simply due to the abundant sunshine and the above average temperatures. So let's take a look at one other place before I dig deep into what's going on in the United States. The heat that we kind of were enduring here over the last week, well, it seems as though Europe is back into its much above average temperature pattern as well. You're seeing here in parts of Germany, France, and nearby countries here that temperatures are going to be getting anywhere between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius above average. Highly amplified pattern moving across Europe right now with a big ridge pushing there into Central Europe up into the Scandinavian countries, bringing in that heat. Over here in the Black Sea region, though, you can see we're cooler than average, and it's actually been wet in eastern parts of Ukraine and, of course, the Russian wheat belt. So highly amplified pattern here that we've seen across much of Europe. Getting back to the U.S., I think a lot of people here slept with the windows open. Early this morning here, you can see temperatures in the 50s and 60s. We saw dew point temperatures much below that, very pleasant, while heat was starting to come back into the west, and that's what we want to talk about here. Because see, the flow of the jet stream, while it's quite stagnant over parts of the Pacific, it's coming here into the Pacific Northwest, making a pretty sharp turn, which is why we're going to be watching for low pressure development repeatedly here through the Canadian prairies in the coming days. But then that deeper trough over the eastern part of the United States is what's brought in that cooler, drier air from Canada, while the ridge is building out west. And this is our flow pattern we're going to talk about. We're going to see where this ridge is going. I want you to pay close attention to two regions that I'm going to be discussing in this video. One is here in western Canada and Alaska. The other is over here between Greenland and the Hudson Bay. Those two areas are going to be crucial to understanding our forecast pattern coming up. We can see that over the last 24 hours, the front that brought in the cooler weather sagged right into this area. Very heavy rainfall through parts of the southeast with some of these local thunderstorms here producing up to 2 to 3 inches of rain. And then, of course, earlier this week, we saw the torrential rains here in the parts of the mid-Atlantic getting up to the northeast. Outside of that, though, much drier than average weather here as this broader ridge has set up. Just some widely scattered showers and storms through parts of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan in recent days. Then the big ridge sitting out west really pumping in the moisture in this clockwise fashion here, rising over the mountains here, producing some locally heavy rains. All right. Taking a look at the last 30 days, I want you to see the major features that I've been seeing here. There's a large section here in the lower Mississippi River Valley that is wet. We know that Tropical Storm Barry moved into there, so a lot of that precipitation's from that, plus that front that sagged in like this over the last couple of days has added to this rainfall. In the northern part, we've had these ridge riders that go through the northern plains, through the high plains, into the Great Lakes states. Some incredible severe weather, damaging some crops, but some very, very heavy rainfall with as well. If you're in this quarter in between, right in through here where I'm kind of coloring, some of the folks in here have been desperate for the rainfall that places on either side of them have been getting. And to make a point here, I live in a little town called Mahomet, Illinois. I'm right over here. I've not mowed my lawn in 3 weeks. Haven't had to. I have cracks showing up in my yard. My grass is dormant, and the crops nearby me are starting to reflect some of the stress that they've seen from some of the flash drought conditions we've been dealing with. Nearby, some bigger thunderstorms, but there are pockets in here in the heart of the Corn Belt that are desperate for some rainfall. And this map shows you there's a big section of very, very good ground here in Iowa, Illinois, parts of Missouri, Indiana, that has right now anywhere between 40 and 70% of normal on rainfall for the month. Okay. Now, as we kind of look forward into our forecast, we got to discuss if these regions are going to get rain. We also want to talk about this. Will we start to see the emergence of the southwestern monsoon? Because it has not yet evolved. Well, in the near term, what are we looking at over the next 7 days? Our storm track is primarily going to be up here in Canada. We will be watching here in the day on Thursday for strong to severe storms to move back through parts of the Dakotas, especially the eastern half of the Dakotas, getting into Minnesota again, and these will move over into Wisconsin. Outside of that, it'll be next Tuesday before we start to see, really Monday into Tuesday, before we see this rain moving through parts of the eastern Corn Belt getting down into the Delta. Now, the front that went through just recently will be hanging out like this. We're going to be watching for tropical thunderstorm activity to be developing here in the Gulf of Mexico. And if there's a place down in the south that I do see wetter than average, it will be this corridor here stretching through parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, parts of Arkansas, and eastern Texas, where we do expect to see more tropical thunderstorm activity happening in that area, okay? But we need to be talking about what's going to happen with precipitation and our temperatures in the coming days. So let's get right into this. Week 2, longer term now. I'm going to tell you, no strong signals are yet emerging. I do anticipate the storm track to stay in Canada. We will be watching a couple of systems moving through and a front that might sag in through this area, pressing a little bit farther to the south with time, bringing some rain into the mid-south. I know you see dry there, but bringing some rain into that area early or middle of next week, but toward the end of the week, pushing it over toward the southern United States. The northern plains storms, I think we're going to continue to see that as this ridge broadens out in this area, so we're going to continue to see our ridge riding events. And also, as that ridge develops, we might start to see a bit of our southwestern monsoon, showing up once we get here into the end of the first week of August. Now, it's the flow that I really want you to take a look at here. We're going to look at the European model first. This is its ensemble, and you just saw it animate all the way out here until August 8th. Watch this again. Notice the multiple troughs sweeping through the Canadian prairies. That's why the storm track is in Canada. Next, see the ridge out west slowly flatten and elongate with time. What does this do to our temperatures? Well, take a look at this. Over the next 5 days, yes, we keep on the cooler bias here across much of the eastern U.S. while the west really warms up. California especially, you have some serious heat moving in the next 3 or 4 days here, so get ready for that as we end this week. Other than that, we start to see a warm up here in parts of the Canadian prairies, but due to some troughing still hanging out in the northwest, got cooler bias at least over the next couple of days. Now, once we get beyond this, look at days 5 through 10. We really start to see the influence of that broader ridge out west. We start to see after the weekend warmth beginning to spread back over toward the east. And the reason why there's cooler weather sitting right here in the down here in the Delta is simply because of a lot of shower and thunderstorm activity in that particular corridor. But the real story, if you ask me about temperatures here, at least in the near term, shows up as we get out into the first week of August. We're looking at the day 11 through 15 time period, so I'm focusing here on the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th of August. The European model really wants to allow the heat to spread across much of the United States and the southern Canadian prairies, only keeping the Delta slightly cooler than average. Now remember, slightly cooler than average in the Delta in August is still very warm. But the GFS and its ensemble really wants to keep a slight cool bias here. And if you want to know the reasons why, take a look at the model differences here. This is outlooking at day 15. This is the European ensemble. This is the GFS ensemble. Notice how much more highly amplified the GFS is. And that more highly amplified pattern is one that we have to take seriously because the GFS performance as of late has been much, much, much better, especially on picking up on the pattern sooner. And that's something I want you to remember as I go through the rest of this forecast video, all right? Now, unfortunately, going beyond day 15, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but I got to go back over to the European model because I don't have a great model run out of the United States that takes us out there. I'm sorry, but I ignore the CFS model quite a bit because it's really struggling right now. What are we seeing? Well, this is August 8th through the 15th. Broader ridge across this area, and the trough that's sitting here between the Hudson Bay and Greenland is there. It's not deeper here. And the difference between it being over on this path, this one over here, is that allows that ridge to broaden out quite a bit. And that's why you see the European model, once we get in here into the second week of the month of August, allowing for some heat to come back in. Above average temperatures, so we're talking about days, again, way in the upper 80s and lower 90s for parts of the Corn Belt. Now, why do we see cool here? More, again, tropical thunderstorm activity, plus the soils in here are very wet from Barry and other recent activity. Why is it cooler in this area? That's the resurgence of the southwestern monsoon. We're starting to see it. Therefore, that's cloud cover dominated and precipitation dominates. We're finally getting into some monsoonal flow. Going even further, this is now August 30th, so I'm looking at the 7 days, the 23rd through the 30th. We can still see that the European model is hanging on to a warmer bias here, and a warmer bias in through here, but near average temperatures in the eastern part of the country. And again, why? The general flow pattern is flat. And the trough, while it still hangs out right into this area, is key for us understanding where the heat is going to be. Now, if I got that trough that was here to push into this area, or even over into this area, oh, the heat would be on. But instead, it's hanging out here between Greenland and the Hudson Bay. And as a consequence of that, that's going to do, the model is consistent here. It's going to keep much of the eastern half of North America maybe on the back on the normal side of things in terms of temperatures. So I asked myself this question because farmers are asking me this question. Is August going to be super hot and dry? Because there's a lot of crop out there that's going to be extremely vulnerable to that. Well, like we are every year, okay? So I'm just going to play a game here. If August 2019 were to end up being in the top 10 hottest and driest Augusts, what would have to happen? We would need to have very stagnant jet stream flow across the central United States. We need to have slow flow here in this area. That would be indicative of a larger ridge. We need to also have very stagnant flow out here in the Central Pacific. That's non-El Nino-like flow, okay, in the jet stream. Next, we also want to have really strong flow going over a ridge right here and dipping into a western North America trough. That particular flow pattern is what we call the negative PNA and the negative EPO flow pattern. That's a play between the trough here and the ridge that's sitting here in parts of the Gulf of Alaska. I would also like to see a deeper trough that sits just off the northeast coast. It's directly south of Greenland. That's the negative North Atlantic oscillation. And if you notice, come down here, I'd want to see cooler than average water stretching across a big section of the Pacific. And that's very indicative of La Nina, okay, so cooler water there. But I want to talk about this as well because the tropics in summer often dominate a lot of the flow. And in general, those hot, dry Augusts for the Corn Belt, now remember, we're looking specifically at the Corn Belt. I'm going to talk about the other regions in a few seconds. Those hot, dry regions tend to have a lot of activity in terms of thunderstorm activity, tropical thunderstorm activity in the eastern Pacific, getting into the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, stretching into the main development region. Also over Indonesia, very, very wet. And then dry here. Now, because the tropics, this is part of the Madden-Julian oscillation, this is part of the quasi-biennial oscillation, this is a part of several of our bigger circulations, because the tropics are such an important factor, let's look at them first. Remember, this is what we want it to look like if it's going to be super hot and dry. What does the European model show right now? Now remember, this is a model forecast. It's wet here. It's dry in those hot, dry years for the Corn Belt. It's dry over Indonesia, but it was wet during those super hot years in the Corn Belt. And we see drier conditions here in the main development region, whereas during those hot, dry years in the Corn Belt, it was typically wetter than average. Now I look at this and I start to try to make a story here, and what I'm saying is, if the European model has a pretty decent handle on the tropics at this point, this is a signal that says the chances of the Corn Belt having one of its top 10 hottest and driest Augusts on record is low. That's my point. Let's continue with the story. Looking at the ocean temperatures, because remember, they're a critical piece as well. The ocean temperatures. Remember, we need to see cool water here and cool water up the eastern part of the United States. Well, we do know that El Nino has collapsed. We've gone out of our weak El Nino conditions here, and the ocean temperatures in this part of the world have been cooling, especially over here. So we've kind of lost that. We've also lost the signal in the atmosphere from it. But look at the warm water building into this area. We call this the Pacific warm blob. Yes, I understand that that's a less than scientific term, but Pacific warm blob is really what it is. We even have low sea ice concentration up here in the Bering Sea right now. So I see those features, and I ask myself, what does this mean? This to me means that we have a low probability of having a strong southern branch of the jet stream. And that tends to be one that can get pretty highly amplified across the United States. So that's another partial signal here that says, gosh, the chances of us setting records in terms of temperature are relatively low at this point. Let's keep on with this discussion. What do we know is going on right now? Well, the Central Pacific atmospheric flow is behaving more like La Nina. What am I talking about? Look right in through here. This, what I'm circling here, is time increasing in this direction, and what I've circled there is the Central Pacific. Where you see those blues, what we're talking about here is stronger easterly winds. That's very indicative of La Nina type behavior. Yes, our global wind anomaly is still below average, and our atmospheric angular momentum anomalies are negative, but they are increasing slightly with time. That's important to think about as well, because if the global wind anomaly stayed very low and atmospheric angular momentum stayed very, very low through the month of August, that would say very, very stagnant weather patterns are in play for a while, okay? Our jet stream has already pushed to the north. Does it stay to the north? Well, it looks like it will stay to the north, but it will keep an active Canadian storm track. And the Atlantic subtropical high, often called the Bermuda high, is pretty far to the east. It's sitting out here rather than sitting over the southeast. And that's what's going to keep the southeast away from extreme drought and heat as well. So if you ask me, Snodgrass, put this all together so that I can understand it, I would tell you this. I think that once we get through the month of August and look back on it, yes, it's going to favor above average temperatures on the whole, which means we put it all together, it will show the redder colors on the map. But I do not see right now any reason to say that we are going to expect to see long duration, sustained, massive heat waves in the eastern two-thirds of the country. I think we're going to do this. Wash, rinse, repeat. What am I talking about? What we just saw recently. We saw how the end of June finished. We saw how the month of July began. We saw how the end here of July is finishing. I think we're going to continue to see that up-down pattern progress forward. I think that's just what we're in for. If I am wrong, what will happen? There will be a deep ridge that will form over the Great Lakes. There will be a broad trough that forms over parts of Western Canada and Alaska, as well as one that will also be forming south of Greenland. If those things show up, pattern goes back to highly amplified. We could get stuck in that pattern with retrograding waves, and it's going to scorch us. But right now, these particular features are not well resolved in longer-term models, and our analog signal, our teleconnection signal, isn't pointing strongly in that direction. There's always the wild card called the tropics. And right now, the tropics, most of our tropical development tends to come out of this area right in through here at this time of year. But anything going on in the mid-Atlantic here, into the main development region here, will have to deal with some very dusty conditions. That's what you're watching here. That's atmospheric optical thickness telling me how much dust is in the atmosphere. And things coming across Africa right now are kicking up a lot of dust. And that dust is traveling across the open Atlantic, and that really tends to shut things down. So that's what I'm seeing right now in terms of the forecast, okay? Wild card is always the tropics this time of year. Very quickly to finish this up, I want to address one last topic. A lot of folks are asking me, what am I expecting to see for an early frost and what's winter going to show up like? I'm just going to tell you, I haven't even fully formed my opinions yet on winter, and I won't probably do that until September, maybe even the beginning of October. So I just don't know yet, and if I told you something and I got it right, it would be a very happy accident, okay? So I'm not going to worry about that. I also want you to understand what we understand about our early frost. Yes, we are all very concerned about the prospect of an early frost, given how late this crop was planted. But I want you to know this about the early frost. I could forecast the month of October to be warmer than average, but on the first week of October, we could get a brief cold snap that gives you your first frost. Frosts are one-off events. Now, let me tell you some bigger picture things I'm seeing with fall. We are clearly going into ENSO-neutral conditions. If it was going to stay El Nino, that tends to make the eastern half of the country cooler than average. ENSO-neutral, well, it gets rid of that. Secondly, that large, warm shield of water that's sitting in the Pacific Ocean, that Pacific warm blob, is something to be talking about. And we will be watching where we're getting tropical convection from all the way from India all the way over to Africa, going the long way, not the short way, but India to Africa. We're going to have to watch that whole area because it could set up these broader waves in the tropics that control our weather. I'm going to watch all of those things. Our global models see all of this, and they have ingested it into their forecast. So it's in there, and they have been trending warmer. This area here, when you looked at previous model runs back from June, from May, from April, was cool, much cooler than average. We've seen a model trend toward warm. We've seen the Western United States trending toward warm, and this is probably a response to the large blob of warmer water that is sitting in parts of the Gulf of Alaska. So as a consequence of all of this, when we see the longer term model trend, I will say that the model trend is one where I am becoming less and less concerned that we're going to get the majority of this crop to finish. Okay? My concern is just slightly less than extremely concerned now. It's something I'm still watching very carefully, but this model trend is one that we need to be paying attention to. But that's why we do these videos every week, so I can give you up to date, up to the minute, updates about what's going on with the weather here. And we do it every single day at my.nutrienagsolutions.com. I hope you found this video insightful. Yes, there was a lot of confusing signals in this, but that's what sometimes we get from the atmosphere. So I'll ask you to do one thing with me, okay? Let's live within a 2-week window here in the coming weeks before we start to see how the remainder of our summer plays out, which will give us better indications on fall. So let's pay close attention to it together. my.nutrienagsolutions.com. I'll go ahead and wrap it up right there. Thank you for your attention. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you again soon.